Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Heidi McGowan, and I'm happy to join you today again as your facilitator. Welcome to the Round 2 Early Learning Hub Technical Assistance webinar. On behalf of the Early Learning Council, we thank you for joining us and hope that today's information is valuable and supports you in your effort, your Early Learning Hub application effort, and most importantly, the important work that you're doing with children and families. Today's webinar topic is Equity and Family Engagement, and we are joined here by Brett Walker of the Early Learning Division. And before we get started, let's just do a quick review of the webinar logistics. All phones are muted. However, we ask that you keep your phone on mute just in case we miss you. And on the top of your screen is a chat box. It should be on the right of your screen, at least it is on my computer here. There's a chat box that will enable you to send in a question for the presenter. Feel free to send in a question at any time, and I'll try to incorporate your questions as we go, but we have saved some time at the end of the presentation to loop back and respond to any questions that you might have. Finally, this webinar is recorded and will be available on the OregonEarlyLearning.com website by the end of the week. And at that website, you should be able to locate and find the webinars that we have previously held over the last couple weeks. All of these webinars will be recorded and available on that website. So our agenda today for the Equity and Family Engagement is that we'll do a very brief review about Early Learning Hubs, and then we'll hear a presentation from Brett Walker on Equity and Family Engagement. We'll have save time for questions and answers, and then we'll do a quick review of the upcoming webinars coming up. So please take note of those. We've had a few adjustments to times and dates, and we've even added another one for you. So let's jump in, talk briefly about what Early Learning Hubs are. And as always, keeping the Early Learning Council goals front and center of all the work that we do is that the Council goals for the state of Oregon are that children arrive at kindergarten ready for success. Children are raised in stable and attached families, and that our services are integrated and aligned into one early learning system focused on results. Early Learning Hubs are a community-based coordinating body created to provide a system approach to early childhood education that works to improve efficiency and outcomes. Early Learning Hubs will build on existing community resources and assets, ask tough questions about what can be done differently to get better results, and of course, as you know, Early Learning Hubs have the option to define your own strategies and service areas to achieve these outcomes. So in Oregon, we are bringing together public schools, early learning providers, healthcare, social services, and the private sector for the first time around these shared outcomes. So let's go ahead and jump in. Brett, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to share with us some strategies about equity and family engagement.
Okay, great. Thanks, Heidi. So we're going to start on these two topics that are very much interrelated with one another. We're going to start with equity, and what we want you to think about as we go through the session today is how do these topics apply to the process that you're going through of developing a strategic plan, as well as the process of developing an application to become a learning hub, an early learning hub, and of course, how do they relate to the day in, day out work that you all are currently engaged in. So what we want to do is start out by creating some shared definitions around what it is that we're talking about. So we want to ask you how you define equity in your community. We're not looking for a correct answer or a dictionary definition. What we're looking for is, what does equity mean to you in your work? And what we'd like to ask you to do is to use the chat box to share your thoughts and ideas. Doesn't have to be, you know, a fully formed sentence in proper English. It could just be some of the ideas that pop into your head, and we'll go from there. So go ahead and use the chat box and let us know what you think when you hear the term equity.
Great, thank you, Brett. So we're asking for a little bit more interactivity today from you, and mostly because we'd like to really glean your perspectives and expertise as we talk about equity and family engagement. So go ahead and we'll take just about a minute and go ahead and send in any thoughts that you have, and we'll read them. We have a few comments and encourage others to continue to send them in, but a few things around what equity means to you is that every person is valued. Another comment is, the first thing I think of is fairness. Another comment is that all children have access to high-quality childcare and education regardless of barriers. Others are opportunities for all communities and kids to succeed. This is different from equality, a comment says, providing equal access to resources or resources appropriate to specific situations. Everyone gets what they need. And then another comment is that equity equals providing supports so all members of the community can access information and services. Another is that all have the opportunity to reach full potential. These are really rich comments, Brett. Thank you for taking time to send them in, and we'll try to keep our eye on those if further comments come in.
Great. Thanks, Heidi, and thanks everybody for sharing your thoughts on that. I think, some of the thoughts, well, all of those thoughts that we just heard are, very much in line with what we want to talk about today. And a couple that stuck out for me are thinking about equity is not equality. They're related but different concepts, and everyone gets what they need. And in order to ensure equitable outcomes and ensure that everyone gets what they need and so that all children can reach their full potential, equity may mean applying different types of strategies and different types of resources and different amounts of time and energy to different groups of people. So one of the tools that we want to share with you today is a document called the Equity Lens, which I realize many of you may already be familiar with. This is a document that was developed by the Oregon Education Investment Board, or OEIB, and has been embraced by the Early Learning Council as well. And what this document does is it provides a set of shared beliefs, vocabulary, and a vehicle for identifying and addressing disparities. And that's disparities both in terms of service delivery and access, and also outcomes. One of the things that we know when we look at outcome data in education and other areas as well, health, social services, et cetera, but when we look at education outcome data, things like third grade reading proficiency, which we know to be so important for children's future academic success, and on through to four-year graduation cohorts and things of that nature, we know that there are disparities that exist between subgroups of children. And ultimately, that is not an acceptable situation for our state or for any other state. And that is a big part of what our work is about closing those opportunity and achievement gaps. So the Equity Lens really focuses on closing opportunity and achievement gaps between children of color and or children living in poverty and their more affluent and or white peers, and also closing the growing gap between Oregon's educational outcomes and where the rest of the country is headed. If you look at big picture state level education outcome data, Oregon isn't doing so well right now in comparison to the rest of the country. So part of what the Equity Lens is all about is around closing those gaps at the local level so that we can do better as a state. And you see the link here to the actual Equity Lens document. I would really encourage you to check that out. As Heidi mentioned, we'll have this posted for you on our website so you can get back to that link pretty easily. Thanks. So here are some of the core beliefs that are outlined in the Equity Lens. And again, these are things that we would really encourage you to think about as you prepare your strategic plan and hub application as ideas to infuse throughout the whole of that application and strategic plan. So first and foremost, everyone has the ability to learn. Second, speaking a language other than English is an asset. I know that many of you will work in areas where there are populations of children who speak languages other than English, and speaking a language other than English is often identified as a barrier. And we really want to flip that on its head and think about how can having communities with multiple languages and multiple cultures be seen as and leveraged as an asset. Children who receive special education services are an integral part of our educational system, and we must welcome the opportunity to be inclusive. So that really has a lot to do with how we create welcoming environments and also the specific types of instructional and classroom practices that need to be happening both in early learning settings and as well as in elementary settings. And of course beyond, but that's really the area where we're primarily focused today. Children who have been described as at risk represent our best opportunity to improve outcomes, and the communities have unique and important solutions for improving outcomes for all children. So as I'm sure you know, a big part of the system transformation that we're undergoing in early learning and a big focus of the early learning hubs is that you all collectively as communities have solutions, and you know your families and your children best and what they need. And what we see as our role at the state level is helping good ideas travel fast and helping you have the type of support and information that you need to do work in your communities, but not to tell you these are specific solutions. We want to provide tools and share information, but at the end of the day, you all are the ones that know what's going to work best in your communities. Next, resource allocation demonstrates priorities. So this is really important, and going back to the idea that equity does not equal equality, one of the ways that that plays out is in resource allocation. So if we are really going to be committed to the idea of equity and closing opportunity and achievement gaps, that needs to be reflected in the way that we allocate resources. And as somebody who comes from a K-12 background, has worked in education for a while now, I know that that's sometimes a hard thing for people who work in education and other social and human service fields to grapple with, because we're working in a context of limited resources and we want to be fair. And we want to make sure that we're giving opportunities to all children. But when we think about how we allocate limited resources, it's important to think about who are the children and families that are most important to target, that are most in need of additional support or whatever the case may be, and be willing to focus there and be willing to have resource allocation reflect that. And finally, ending disparities and gaps in achievement begins with parent engagement and support and the delivery of high-quality early learning services. So really this is equity. The idea of equity and quality should not be held separately. Improving equitable practices and striving towards equitable outcomes ultimately improves overall service delivery quality. The equity lens also provides us with some key questions to guide decision-making. One, who are the racial and ethnic underserved groups affected? Does the decision being made ignore or worsen existing disparities? How does the investment or resource allocation advance the 40-40-20 goal? What are the barriers to more equitable outcomes? What is the impact on eliminating opportunity gaps? How are you collecting data on race, ethnicity, native language? I would also include socioeconomic status, as I know that that is an important indicator and subset of data for many of you throughout the state, depending on which communities you're representing. How will you modify or enhance your strategies to ensure each child and community's individual and cultural needs are met? And what is your commitment to professional learning for equity? So what this reflects to me is that these sets of questions are really guiding questions that can help you all as you collaborate to develop your strategic plan and hub application, to have some of the deeper and perhaps more challenging conversations about who it is that you're really trying to serve and reach, and what it will take to achieve more equitable outcomes. And I would also really call attention to this last one around professional learning for equity. Equity is ultimately a process, and different people are at different places, and it's very much an individual journey. And one of the things that's really important in this work, I think, is to really commit to continued shared and collaborative learning around what equity really means in your community. So one way to think about, operationalizing the equity lens so that it's not just an idea but something that can actually be used on a regular basis is applying a continuous improvement model. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this type of model or something similar to it, but the idea here is that there are certain big picture steps that you all can be taking on a regular basis to make sure that the strategies, policies, practices that you put into place are equitable and drive towards equitable outcomes. The first one of those steps is to convene. And what we're really talking about there is pulling together a collaborative group of people that are reflective of and representative of the children and families that you are seeking to serve. The next step is to assess your practices, policies, and programs for equity. And in a moment, I'm going to share a tool with you that could potentially help you do that. So once you've convened a collaborative group and assessed your practices for equity, the next step is to design strategies and then execute strategies. So design is, we're really talking about developing your strategic plan, both at the hub level, but then kind of on an ongoing basis as well. We're constantly designing different types of strategies, supports, and interventions across education, healthcare, and human services. And then execute. So that's put those strategies into place. We got people together, we looked at where we are, and we identified gaps, we identified areas for improvement, we designed strategies to address those areas for improvement and to achieve more equitable outcomes. Now we're going to go do what we said we were going to do. And then finally, evaluate. And so that's evaluating both from a process standpoint, but also from a standpoint of really looking at the data and looking at what the outcomes tell us in terms of have we been successful in closing the gaps that we identified. And I think that this is an area where data can be really powerful. One of the things that you will receive, if you have not already, is essentially a prototype of a hub report for the recent kindergarten assessment data. One of the things that does is it disaggregates the data by zip code and by student subgroup along the lines of race and ethnicity. So what we think and what we hope is that over time, that kindergarten assessment data at your local hub level will become a powerful set of data for addressing the question of, have we been effective in closing gaps in opportunity and in preparedness for kindergarten and readiness for kindergarten in the specific areas that the kindergarten assessment measures. And we'll talk more about that in a couple weeks when we get to the 3-to-3 webinar, which Heidi will talk more about later on, but we'll have an opportunity to go more deeply into that. But I just bring that up as an example of the type of data that can be used in an evaluation process to assess how effective your strategies have been in closing the opportunity and achievement gaps that you've identified. What I'd like to do now is share a tool that can help lead you at the local level on a collaborative self-assessment process related to equitable practices.
So we're going to ask you bear with us just a second as we pull up another document. Oh, that was very smooth.
Not too bad.
Excellent.
So this is a document that was developed very recently, as you can see, January 2014, by the Coalition of Communities of Color and a collaborative in Multnomah County called All Hands Raised. And as you can see, this is an organizational self-assessment related to racial equity. What I want to say before, and we're not going to go through every single page of this, but what I want to say before we get into this is that we know that when we're talking about equity, we're not just talking about race and ethnicity. This particular tool is designed to assess racial equity. We also want to encourage you to assess equitable practices related to socioeconomic status and working with families who are in poverty regardless of their race and ethnicity, working with children and families who speak a language other than English, There are all types of equity that we want to be looking at, and race and ethnicity is certainly an important one. And you know, we also recognize that it's not the only one, nor is this the only tool that's out there to do this. We just, you know, wanted to share this as an example of a good tool to use. So I'll just spend a quick minute here.
And Brett, just so the listeners on the phone know, we will be able to post this with the PowerPoint and the recorded webinar on the Early Learning website, correct?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah. So you can see here in this sort of introductory section, they're describing the purpose of the tool, and you can see, you know, it's similar to what we just shared. What they're sharing here is a process, okay? So completing the assessment is part of the process, then moving into an action plan, and then implementing the plan and evaluating from there on an ongoing basis. Let me just move. So basically what this does, as you can see, is this is going to ask you to go through a collaborative process and self-assess specific organizational characteristics using a very simple scoring rubric. One of the things that I will say about using a tool like this is that the scores themselves are not, you know, that's not the end-all be-all. And I think that I've experienced situations in which collaborative groups can get caught up in, well, is this a 2 or is this a 3? And at the end of the day, what's more important about that is going through the process and asking the questions about, you know, how are we doing as an organization in these specific areas? And what are our areas of strength, and what are our strongest competencies in relation to racial equity in this case? So it's not so much about getting hung up on the specific number of the score, but really about identifying areas where you feel as a community you're, you know, doing well, and as a community where there may be areas for improvement. So you see here organizational commitment, leadership, and governance. And we're going to talk more about governance and decision-making in just a minute with family engagement. But just, you know, to give you a sense of what some of the questions are and some of the areas are with this particular tool. So again, you see some of the things that we've been talking about: resource allocation, data metrics, continuous quality improvement. So I'm going to bring us back into our presentation right now, but as Heidi mentioned, we'll be able to get this up on our website. You'll be able to take a deeper look into it. And really what our objective for now is just to share this with you as, you know, again, an example of a tool that can be used for that assessment process of the continuous improvement cycle related to equity. I would also, as we go forward here, encourage you that if you all have questions that you'd like to ask as we go, feel free to ask those in the chat box, and we'll make sure to get to those as we go along. I'd like to switch gears just a little bit and talk about family engagement, which, as we mentioned, is certainly a very, very related concept to equity, but touches on a few different things as well. What we'd like to do is ask you again, using the chat box, to define family engagement. And once again, we're not looking for a correct answer or a dictionary definition. Oops, this slide said, what does equity mean to you? But that should, of course, say, what does family engagement mean to you in your community? And we'd like you to use the chat box again to share your thoughts and ideas about family engagement. So when you hear the term family engagement, what are you thinking about, and how does that relate to the work that you do?
Great, thank you, Brett. So let's take just about a minute again and give you a chance to reflect on that, on what family engagement means to you, and send your comments in over the chat box, and we'll share them with the others. Okay, we'll share with you some of the comments that are coming in. Thank you for taking time to do that. Let's see here. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. Family engagement means that there is two-way communication with families in which both parties are learning from each other. Another comment is that their family engagement is meaningful participation. Another comment is giving parents, guardians a voice and empowerment to be stronger and more effective parents. Another is building relationship with families, not, in all caps, not just sending flyers home. Responding to and acting on issues, requests raised via the surveys. Dedicated seats on our board of directors. Rescheduling events and activities based on family availability, not on our schedule, and asking their opinions, then posting them on our website. Sharing them with others. Thank you. Then also we have family engagement incorporates elements of families knowing how to best support children's learning at home, how to be involved in school activities, and ability to access and participate in the school in a variety of ways. Then we have that families are key to their child's learning. Family involvement and building on family strengths is critical to getting good outcomes, or is critical good outcomes. And then we have empowering families to take on an active role in their child's learning and life, creating the bridges between families and resources. So there's a lot of rich comments there, Brett. I'll let you run with those.
Great. All right. Thanks, Heidi, and thank you, everybody. That's really wonderful comments, and I think what I hear captured in there is the idea that family engagement is really a process of relationship building, and that it is something that takes some time and to be done well, and also that it really is very much linked to children's learning and development, and that's really a key part of this whole conversation around family engagement. I think sometimes family engagement can feel like an extra or something that is done because it feels good, but at the end of the day, family engagement is really a critical strategy for helping children achieve academic success, develop in ways that are healthy and appropriate, and just be healthy, successful, safe, learning, growing children. So when we think about family engagement, it's really important to think about it not as an extra, an add-on, not as something that we do because it feels good, but we do it because it drives us and our communities and our children towards those equitable outcomes that we've been talking about. So this framework of taking engagement from program to practice was published a few years ago by an organization called the Harvard Family Research Project, which I imagine many of you are familiar with. And they proposed a new way of thinking about family engagement that has actually also been ultimately adopted and embraced by the U.S. Department of Education, and is really the direction that the field of family engagement is moving right now. And what this idea means from program to practice is we want to move away from the idea of family engagement as a set of activities or a specific program or intervention, and more towards the idea of family engagement being just embedded in practice, whether that is, the practice of child care providers, of pre-K teachers, of schools, of health and human service organizations, of healthcare. That family engagement is just part of the core responsibility of any professional that works with children and families. And the key tenets of this idea are family engagement as a shared responsibility. So, essentially what that means is that, of course, we all want families to be engaged with their child at home and engaged in their child's learning and development, and also that as professionals working with children and families, we also have a responsibility to help foster the type of family engagement that occurs both at home and in other venues in the community. Family engagement is continuous across the child's life, and it actually looks a little bit different as children get older and move into different developmental stages. So, for example, when we're talking about working with families who have children ages, 0 to 3 or even 0 to 18 months, or, the infants and toddlers, as providers, it may be more appropriate to focus energy on building family capacity around healthy early child development. As they get older and move from pre-K into school, it becomes more important to build family capacity around how to support learning at home, and so on. And basically what this is getting at is that family engagement is certainly not a one-size-fits-all strategy, and we need to be responsive to the needs of families and where their children are in their developmental process. And then finally, it occurs in multiple settings where children learn. So, one of the common things that I've seen in my experience working in family engagement in K-12 settings is I would often hear a common refrain of, well, we invited families to come to the school, but only a few of them showed up, so it seems like our families aren't engaged. What's really important to remember is that engagement in children's learning and development happens everywhere. It happens at schools, it happens in their child care settings, it happens in their pre-K programs, it happens in healthcare settings, and it happens at home. And it's going to look different for different families. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So again, at the bottom, you can see that we posted a link here to this particular document that this is taken from. If you're not familiar with it, I would really encourage you to just take a look and check it out. It's the kind of thing that may help frame your thinking as you develop your family engagement strategies for your strategic planning or hub application. Going a little bit deeper, we wanted to share some information about some of the important types of family engagement. And these are not the only types of family engagement, but they may be particularly important for you in the work that you're doing right now. And we wanted to share some examples of what this has looked like with some of the round one early learning hubs. So the first is governance and decision making. So essentially engaging families in the collaborative process of governance and decision making at the hub level. This is something that all the cohort 1 early learning hubs addressed. Lane County in particular has a really interesting model for using a parent advisory council that's kind of a substructure of their overall hub governance. And Multnomah County identified a similar strategy, which they call a parent accountability council, which is made up of caregivers of children ages 0 through 6, with a focus on caregivers serving communities of color, which has been identified as their target population. So that's, again, really important that the people that are being engaged whose voices are at the table in the governance and decision-making process are reflective of the communities that the hub is seeking to serve. One of the things that we saw mentioned in the chat box a few minutes ago, one of the first things we saw was two-way communication, which is so important to the process of building an ongoing relationship with children's families. One really interesting example of this comes from the Frontier Early Learning Hub, which serves Grant and Harney counties in eastern Oregon. Very rural, very low population density. For them, it's not realistic to think about hosting events and inviting families to come when those families may need to come 100 miles or 50 miles in one direction or whatever the case may be. For them, it's much more important to maintain communication and to make sure that they're getting information that's valuable to families in their homes. So from a strategy standpoint, they've really emphasized home visiting and embedding family engagement within the home visiting context. They're also working on a strategy that they call preschool by mail, which basically is around sending preschool curriculum home to families to do with their children at home and building family capacity to help children have the types of experiences that 3- and 4-year-olds might have in a more formal pre-K setting. so that they've gotten really creative with how they think about building two-way communication that's built around child learning and development, and that also builds family capacity to support those processes. And then finally, supporting child developmental learning at home. Again, the South Central Early Learning Hub, which is Douglas and Lake counties, have identified in their strategic plan strengthening parenting practices as one of their high priorities. And some of the things that they've outlined as sub-priorities of that goal are, one, to make parenting education a norm. There is stigma around parenting education. I know this because I'm a parent of young children myself, and there are times when I need help. So, but it's the kind of thing that, it can be hard for parents to admit, I don't have, all the skills that I need to support my child at this stage of their development, or I could use some support around this. And so, the work that South Central is doing to make parenting education a norm and to destigmatize it and to make it, this is just part of the process, and that being a parent is hard, and that, we all need some support with it, is a really great starting place, I think. Additionally, they have really wanted to, in their strategic plan, they've really outlined wanting to focus on evidence-based parenting education practices. So they're not just pulling things out of a hat. They're really looking at what works, what has been shown to work, what evaluation data do we have available to us that tells us that this is an effective strategy for building parent capacity. And using tools, one that's mentioned is called the Parent Skills Ladder. And the other thing that they're really doing with their parent engagement strategy is focusing on transitions, focusing on that important transition from early learning into kindergarten, which is so important for the work that we're all doing. So those are just some examples of how different communities around the state have embedded these concepts, these types of family engagement into their strategic plans. One thing I would encourage you to do, if you haven't already, is on our website, OregonEarlyLearning.com, go to the section for Early Learning Hubs and look at the most recent legislative report. What that will do is that will provide you kind of a high-level synopsis of each of the strategic plans from the Round 1 Early Learning Hubs, and including how they're addressing family engagement at a high level, but it's valuable nevertheless. So this is a quote that I came upon recently by an organization called the Declaration Initiative, which is really focused on eradicating poverty. And I like this because I think it really speaks to the process of engaging families in decision-making at the governance level. And as you can see, what this is really getting at is the importance of engaging those families that you will be seeking to serve in the process of developing the strategies that you're going to use to reach the big three outcomes that Heidi mentioned at the beginning of our webinar today. So I would encourage you to make sure that the voices of those families are at the table throughout the process, and not just from a standpoint of we're going to do our application, and then once we officially become an early learning hub, then we're going to make sure that we have family voice at the table. I would really encourage that family voice be at the table and be part of the decision-making process right from the get-go. And I know that many of you are already there, and I just want to reinforce that that's absolutely the right way to be going at it. So here's one other tool I wanted to share. This is again, kind of a high-level framework or tool for thinking about how different families are engaged. And this was actually put together originally by a woman named Karen Mapp, who shared it with myself and another colleague in a previous place of work. Karen is a co-author of a book called Beyond the Bake Sale, which is a really phenomenal book around family engagement in the K-12 sphere, and she's a leader in the field. And what she's identified here are different ways that families are engaged at different stages of their children's lives in the different settings where children learn and grow. So, for our purposes, certainly the first two rows where it speaks to all levels, and then early childhood and elementary are the ones where we want to be focused. And we don't have to go through all of this right now, but again, this is just another tool for you all to think about as you prepare your family engagement strategies. And one of the ones that I would really encourage you to think about how you might affect as an early learning hub is the very first one you see around having high expectations for learning. There's a lot of research out there that shows that having high expectations for learning and the type of expectations that families share with their children around the value of education is critical. And that's really important when we think about the idea of going from program to practice, because that's not something that we can easily capture by saying, we did an event, we hosted parenting workshops. It's not as tangible, and it's not as easy to measure and all of that, but it's also very important. So it's something to just keep in mind as you develop your family engagement strategies.
Yeah, we have a comment from somebody just that's providing another excellent resource to the conversation, and it's called the Research to Practice Series on Family Engagement, Prepared for Head Start by the National Center on Parent, Family, and Community Engagement. And the note is that so far 5 in the series are focusing on family connections to peers and communities, family engagement in transitions, families as advocates and leaders, families as lifelong educators, and positive parent-child relationships. So thank you for sharing that resource. Head Start does have a lot of great family engagement strategies and resources as well, but thank you for calling that one out.
Absolutely. Thank you. One other thing that we wanted to share that we thought might be helpful is just some components of effective family engagement strategies. So you'll see that, these first few bullets, approaching families from an asset perspective, I'm sure that that's something that, a concept that you're all very familiar with, being welcoming and inclusive of all families, and then meeting families where they are. And when I talk about meeting families where they are, it's, both from the tangible and intangible standpoint. In Grant and Harney County, we're seeing a really tangible example of meeting families where they are. I mean, literally going, to their homes and not expecting them to come to us, but to physically go to the places where families are likely to gather and be is really important. And then also, of course, meeting families where they are more from the social, emotional standpoint of, recognizing that, people are dealing with different circumstances in their lives, and we need to be respectful of those and honor where different people are in their journeys as families. As we talked about, effective family engagement strategies are all about ongoing two-way communication and relationship building, and that sometimes requires a lot of patience and a lot of persistence. And a real desire to stick with it. We heard earlier that family engagement is not about just putting a flyer in a backpack and sending it home with a child. And that's absolutely right. It can't be about, well, we sent them a flyer, but they didn't respond to it, so, we're out of luck. Sometimes to reach the families of the children who are most in need and the children that we most need to be working with, it takes some patience and persistence. And then, finally, again, as we mentioned, family engagement is ultimately around building family capacity to support children's learning and development, and it links to improved outcomes for children. So, this kind of takes us full circle and back to what we were talking about with equity at the beginning of the session, that this is ultimately, when we think about why do we work hard to engage families, to make sure family voice is represented in decision-making, to make sure that providers and educators have the skills and tools necessary to build meaningful relationships with children's families, and that families have a toolkit to support their child's learning at home. why do we do it? It's all about improving outcomes. It's all about closing those opportunity gaps, the achievement gaps that we've talked about today. And that's something that we need to always keep in mind, that family engagement is a part of the work that needs to ultimately be outcome-driven. So one of the last things that we wanted to share with you before we go ahead and open it up for questions is, what practices can the hub shift to create equitable outcomes for all children and families? And what are the persistent opportunity gaps, and who are you having trouble reaching? Those are some really high-level questions that may help you think about how do we create a really equitable strategic plan that is focused on reaching children and families that need help the most and is going to drive outcomes. And similar set of questions for family engagement. What are some strategies and practices that will help you engage the families of your target population? What are the highest leverage family engagement opportunities? And how can you shift from program to practice? So with that, we'll open it up for your questions. Please feel free to go ahead and write any questions or comments that you have in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and answer them to the best of our ability.
Thank you, Brett. So we heard quite a bit today, really on the two themes around equity and then also family engagement. Equity, I think we heard from our participants through chat box as well as you, Brett, that equity is really not just about equality. It's ensuring that children get what they need, and that in particular you called out that early learning hubs, we as a state, or regardless of the organization, that you'd be willing to focus resources based upon where children are and what they need, children and families. You called out quite a bit about continuous learning and using data as a key factor in your continuous improvement plan to adjust strategies and ensure that you're moving the targets. So we have a question here that we'll go ahead and jump in. So how do you help parents with very little or no formal education have higher expectations for their children? I know of a family in which the parent is illiterate, unable to sign her name on a form, and her child already has surpassed her education by the time that he was in kindergarten. Thanks for sharing that. So how do you help parents with little or formal education have higher expectations for their children?
Well, a few thoughts on this one. One is, I think that, as I mentioned before, this whole process of helping families understand and embrace and share with their children the value of getting an education and going out into the society, with a sound education under their belts, that's a long-term process. That's part of what I was talking about with patience, persistence, and we also have to tread lightly on the reality that it is not our job to ultimately change another person's value system. That said, I think that one way to get at this idea of wanting to create some stronger maybe community norms around the value of education is to tap into parent leaders. There are so many folks out there who did not have the benefit of getting a great education themselves when they were children, but really want something better for their for their own children. And I think particularly that's a common theme in immigrant communities. I don't want to overgeneralize, but certainly it's a theme in our country that people will come here and settle down as a way to create a better life for their children. So they may not necessarily have a lot of formal education themselves, but may still be very much able to and willing to give the message to their children that it's important that you get a good education, and that's why we're here, and that's why we've made these sacrifices. And that's something that I think people can wrap their heads around, regardless of the level of formal education that they have themselves. So again, it's a process, and again, I think that this is an area where developing parent leaders and having parents working with other parents is going to be much more valuable, you know, than those of us who are in professional positions, you know, going to people and saying you have to value education. That's not a message that's going to be heard, but to the extent that we can help people who are in similar situations, you know, build each other's capacity and build that peer support network and that parent leadership network, that I think is what, you know, is ultimately going to move the needle on something like creating a higher level of expectation around the value of education in the community.
Right, thank you, Brett. Thank you for sharing that comment and also question. Very, very valuable. So we still have just a couple more minutes if anybody has any final questions, but as we're heading to our close, I would like to call out and make sure you have on your calendar the upcoming webinars. We have added an additional webinar that will be next Tuesday, March 11th, from 1 to 2 p.m. on Early Learning Hub budgets and funding streams. So any questions that you have around budgets, that'll be a great one to attend. Rhonda Nelson from the Early Learning Division will be presenting some information on Early Learning Hub budgets and funding streams. And then March 19th, I believe that's a Wednesday, Building a Strong K-3 Connection, and Brett Walker will be joining us again, talking a little bit more about that early learning and K-3 connection. And as well as we'll talk a little more about the kindergarten assessment in that webinar. Then March 27th, it's the Thursday, from 10 to 11, we'll talk about Oregon's QRIS. Don Woods from the Early Learning Division will join us to talk about the Quality Rating and Improvement System and improving quality in early learning and development programs. And then March 31st, our last one will be held from 12 to 1 p.m. and it's Building a Strong Healthcare Connection. Dana Harginani from the Oregon Health Authority will be here along with some representatives from CCOs to talk about how early learning hubs and CCOs are building a strong connection between some shared outcomes between the health system and the early learning system. So those are our upcoming webinars. Again, we'll be sending out reminders every week, and we'll include these dates and times, but just wanted you to have those on your radar. I don't see any more questions that we have, so we'll go ahead and close with some contact information for Brett Walker, as well as, of course, Megan Irwin, the Early Learning Systems Design Manager, if you have any questions. And again, this webinar will be recorded on OregonEarlyLearning.com by the end of the week. And as we look ahead to next week's webinars, just a reminder that our times for the webinars, on the WebEx, they appear to be earlier to allow the presenters and us to set up. So just so you know, if it shows that the webinar is half hour earlier than I've just said, we won't get started until the advertised time. So with that, thank you, Brett, for taking time to share with us on this important topic, and thank you for listening in and being part of our conversation and actively participating in our chat sessions today. So we look forward to you joining us next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.